You know, we think modern relationships are complicated. We've got dating apps, ghosting, situationships. But let me tell you about a love story so wild, so absolutely bonkers, that it makes every reality TV show look boring by comparison. Picture this. Ancient Rome, 67 AD. The most powerful man in the world, Emperor Nero, is about to do something that will shock the entire empire. He's getting married. Again. But this time it's not to some noble lady or political ally. No, no, no. This time he's marrying a young man named Sporus. And here's where it gets really weird. Before the wedding, Nero has Sporus castrated and then proceeds to treat him exactly like a Roman empress. We're talking the full imperial treatment, fancy clothes, jewelry, the title of Augusta, everything. And the craziest part? This actually happened. This isn't some myth or exaggeration. Multiple Roman historians documented this. We have receipts from ancient Rome, people. Now, before we dive into this absolute circus of a story, I need you to understand something about Nero. This guy wasn't just any emperor. He was the drama king of ancient Rome. We're talking about a man who allegedly fiddled while Rome burned, though that's probably not true since fiddles didn't exist yet, but you get the point. This is a guy who kicked his pregnant wife to death, had his own mother murdered, and thought he was the greatest artist who ever lived. Spoiler alert, he wasn't. But the Sporus situation, that takes the cake, that takes the whole bakery. Let's rewind a bit. Before Sporus entered the picture, Nero was married to a woman named Poppaea Sabina. By all accounts, he actually loved her. Roman historians say she was beautiful, ambitious, and one of the few people who could handle Nero's massive ego. They had a daughter together, though sadly she died young. Then, in 65 AD, disaster struck. Poppaea was pregnant again, and according to the historian Suetonius, Nero kicked her in the stomach during an argument. She died shortly after, along with their unborn child. Now, some historians debate whether this actually happened or if she died from complications during childbirth. But either way, Nero was devastated, genuinely devastated. This is where our story really begins, because Nero's grief was about to take a very, very strange turn. About 2 years after Poppaea's death, Nero was traveling through Greece, because of course he loved Greece and thought he was basically a Greek god in human form, when he encountered a young boy named Sporus. And here's what made Nero stop in his tracks. Sporus apparently looked remarkably similar to Poppaea. Same features, same build, same general appearance. Now you might think, okay, so he saw someone who reminded him of his dead wife. That's sad, but not that weird. Oh, sweet summer, child. We're just getting started. Nero didn't just think, oh, that person looks like Poppaea. No, this man looked at Sporus and basically said, you know what? I'm going to make you into Poppaea. And he meant it literally. So Nero has Sporus castrated, just orders it done. And then, and I cannot stress enough how bizarre this is, he has Sporus dress in women's clothing, gives him the name Sabina, after Poppaea Sabina, and marries him in a full legitimate Roman wedding ceremony. We're not talking about some private affair. This was public. There were witnesses. There was a dowry. There was a wedding veil. The whole 9 yards. The ceremony followed traditional Roman marriage customs almost exactly. Sporus wore the wedding veil, the flammeum, which was the bright orange-yellow veil that Roman brides wore. There were wedding contracts. There were priests. The Roman elite attended because, well, you didn't exactly turn down an invitation from the emperor, even if you thought he'd completely lost his mind. And after the wedding, Nero treated Sporus exactly like an empress. He called Sporus his wife. Sporus received the title and honors of Augusta, which was the title given to the emperor's wife. When they appeared in public together, Sporus wore the clothes and jewelry of a Roman empress. Nero would kiss Sporus in public, just as he had with Poppaea. The Roman people, they were absolutely stunned, confused, horrified. Remember, this is ancient Rome we're talking about. They had very specific ideas about gender roles and what was acceptable behavior. Roman men having relationships with other men wasn't actually that shocking. It was fairly common, though there were rules about it. But this, a public marriage with full legal recognition, having someone castrated and essentially forcing them to take on a female identity, that was completely unprecedented, and we're only just getting started with this story. So now Nero's got his new wife, and he's parading Sporus around Rome like everything is completely normal. But here's what's really messing with everyone's heads. Nero isn't treating this like some kind of joke or temporary situation. He's dead serious about this. Sporus is attending imperial functions. Sporus is sitting where the empress would sit. Sporus is being consulted on matters of state. This is Nero's actual life now. The Roman historians who documented this were basically the ancient equivalent of someone witnessing a car crash in slow motion. They couldn't look away, and they definitely couldn't believe what they were seeing. Cassius Dio, who wrote about this decades later, said that people wished Nero's father had married this type of woman instead, basically saying it would have been better if Nero had never been born. That's how disturbed people were by this whole situation. Another historian, Suetonius, documented it in his biographies of the Caesars with this mix of shock and dark fascination. These weren't gossip columnists making stuff up. These were serious historians trying to make sense of what on earth their emperor was doing. But let's talk about Sporus for a second, because in all of this crazy story, we rarely hear about what he thought about any of this. The historical records don't really give us Sporus's perspective, which is frustrating because I would pay good money to know what was going through his head. Did he have a choice in any of this? Almost certainly not. When the Emperor of Rome decides you're going to be his wife, you don't exactly have the option to say, thanks, but no thanks. Think about the position Sporus was in. On one hand, he went from being a relatively unknown young person to being the companion of the most powerful man in the world. He had wealth, status, and protection. On the other hand, he'd been castrated, forced to take on a female identity, and was basically living as a replacement for a dead woman. That's not a love story, that's a horror story. And it gets darker. Because Nero didn't just want Sporus to look like Poppaea and act like Poppaea. He wanted Sporus to be Poppaea. This wasn't about love or attraction, not really. This was about Nero's inability to deal with grief and loss like a normal person. Instead of going to therapy, not that they had therapy in ancient Rome, but you know what I mean, he literally tried to recreate his dead wife using another human being. The thing is, Rome had seen some weird stuff before. This was an empire where emperors declared themselves gods, where political enemies were executed in creative and horrifying ways, where entertainment involved watching people fight to the death. But this situation with Sporus, this was a new level of bizarre even for Rome. The Roman Senate didn't know what to do. They couldn't exactly oppose Nero openly. The guy had a nasty habit of killing people who disagreed with him. His own mother had learned that lesson the hard way, but they also couldn't just pretend everything was fine. So they did what politicians have done throughout history. They smiled in public and complained in private. Meanwhile, Nero and Sporus continued their strange relationship. They traveled together, attended games and theatrical performances together, and by all accounts, Nero seemed genuinely attached to Sporus. He was protective of him, affectionate in public, and treated him with the honors due to an empress. But here's where we need to talk about what life was actually like for Sporus during this time. Imagine living every day in someone else's identity, not being allowed to be yourself, having to respond to a name that isn't yours. wearing clothes that you might not have chosen, playing a role every single moment of every single day. And not just any role, the role of a dead woman, constantly being compared to someone else, constantly being expected to be someone you're not. It's worth noting that castration in ancient Rome wasn't like it is in modern times. They didn't have proper anesthesia or sterile surgical techniques. It was brutal, dangerous, and often resulted in severe health complications or death. The fact that Sporus survived it at all is remarkable. But surviving physically is one thing. The psychological trauma of the entire situation is something else entirely. And through all of this, Roman society was watching and whispering. The gossip must have been absolutely wild. Can you imagine the conversations at Roman dinner parties? Did you hear about the emperor's new wife? You mean the boy he had castrated? I literally cannot believe this is our life now. But just when you think this story can't get any stranger, we need to talk about what happened next. Because Nero's reign wasn't going to last forever. Things were falling apart for Nero. The Roman Senate had had enough of his antics, the military was turning against him, and rebellions were popping up across the empire. Turns out, marrying a castrated boy and treating him like an empress wasn't even in the top 10 reasons people wanted Nero gone. He'd also bankrupted the treasury, rebuilt half of Rome as his personal palace after the Great Fire, and generally been a terrible emperor. The Sporus situation was just the cherry on top of a very chaotic, very expensive disaster sundae. When Nero realized he was done for, he did what any dramatic emperor would do. He decided to kill himself. But even in death, Nero had to make it theatrical. According to historical accounts, his last words were something like, "What an artist dies in me." Because of course they were. Even facing death, the guy couldn't stop thinking about how this would play as a performance. After Nero's suicide in June 68 AD, chaos erupted in Rome. The year of the 4 emperors was about to begin, and Sporus found himself in an incredibly dangerous position. He'd been the wife of a now hated dead emperor. That's not exactly a great resume line. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Remember, Sporus still looked remarkably feminine, still had the status and appearance of an empress, and was now essentially up for grabs. And the next few emperors, they apparently saw Sporus as some kind of prize. First up was Emperor Otho, who ruled for about 3 months in 69 AD. Otho had actually been friends with Nero. In fact, he'd been married to Poppaea before Nero stole her away. So when Otho became emperor, what did he do? He took Sporus as his companion. Some sources suggest he might have even gone through a marriage ceremony with Sporus too, though the historical record is less clear on this. Either way, Otho treated Sporus with the same honors that Nero had. Think about how weird this is from Sporus's perspective. Your first husband, the guy who had you castrated and forced you to pretend to be his dead wife, kills himself. Then his friend, who was married to the woman you're supposed to be replacing, decides he wants you now. Sporus couldn't catch a break. But Otho's reign was short-lived. He lost a civil war to Vitellius and killed himself in April 69 AD. That's 3 months. Sporus had been with him for 3 months before having to deal with another emperor. Vitellius became the next emperor, and guess what? He also became interested in Sporus. But Vitellius's interest was different, and this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Vitellius apparently wanted to use Sporus for public entertainment. He wanted to parade Sporus in a public spectacle, possibly even have Sporus participate in a mock rape scene during public games, playing the role of a captured maiden. This was meant to humiliate and mock Nero's memory, using Sporus as a prop. For Sporus, this must have been the final straw. After years of being used as a living doll, after being passed from emperor to emperor like an object, the prospect of being publicly humiliated and violated was too much. According to the historian Cassius Dio, Sporus killed himself rather than submit to this degradation. And just like that, the story of the emperor's unusual wife ended in tragedy. Sporus, who never asked for any of this, who never chose to be castrated or to become an empress or to be passed between emperors, chose death over further humiliation. It's a heartbreaking end to an already heartbreaking story. But let's zoom out for a second and think about what this whole bizarre episode tells us about ancient Rome and about power in general. This wasn't really a story about love or even about unusual marriages. This was a story about the absolute corruption of absolute power. Nero had so much power that he could completely reshape another person's life on a whim. He could take a young person, castrate them, force them into a new identity, and make them live out his fantasy of bringing his dead wife back to life, and nobody could stop him because he was the emperor. It's also a story about how historical figures, especially those without power, get reduced to footnotes in other people's stories. We don't know much about Sporus's life before Nero. We don't know what his dreams were, what he wanted to do with his life, what he actually thought about any of this. The historical record preserved him only as an object in Nero's story, as a curiosity, as evidence of Nero's madness. And that's perhaps the saddest part of all. So what do we actually take away from this absolutely bonkers piece of ancient history? Because it's easy to treat this story as just some weird historical curiosity, something to shock people with at parties. Hey, did you know that Emperor Nero married a castrated boy? Crazy, right? But there's actually a lot more going on here than just ancient Roman weirdness. First off, this story gives us a window into just how differently ancient Romans thought about gender and sexuality compared to how we think about it today. And I'm not saying they were more progressive or more accepting. They definitely weren't in most ways, but their categories were different. For Romans, the big issue wasn't whether you were attracted to men or women. The issue was about power, about who was dominant and who was submissive. A Roman man could have relationships with other men, and that was generally fine, as long as he was the dominant partner, and as long as it didn't interfere with his duties to marry and have children. But what Nero did with Sporus broke all their rules. He didn't just have a relationship with a man, he publicly married someone, gave them the status of empress, and treated them as his wife. That challenged fundamental Roman ideas about masculinity, power, and proper social order. It wasn't the relationship itself that shocked them. It was how Nero formalized and publicized it. And let's be real about something else. The way historians have written about this over the centuries tells us as much about those historians' own times as it does about ancient Rome. Medieval Christian writers use Nero and Sporus as evidence of pagan Roman depravity. Victorian historians could barely bring themselves to discuss it, dancing around the details with euphemisms. Modern historians have debated whether this says something about ancient concepts of transgender identity, though that's applying modern frameworks to a situation that was really about power and control rather than identity. But beyond all the historical and academic analysis, there's a human story here that we shouldn't forget. Sporus was a real person who lived through something traumatic and bizarre. Every time we tell this story as just a funny or shocking historical anecdote, we're kind of doing what the Romans did, treating Sporus as an object, a curiosity, rather than as a person who suffered. Think about it. Sporus lived in what must have been a constant state of fear and unreality. Forced to be someone else, passed from emperor to emperor like property, never allowed to just exist as himself, and ultimately driven to suicide rather than face further humiliation. That's not a punchline, that's a tragedy. This story also reminds us that absolute power really does corrupt absolutely. Nero could do this because no one could stop him. He was so powerful, so unchecked, that he could reshape another person's entire existence based on his own psychological needs. And that's terrifying. It's the same kind of absolute power that led him to murder his mother, kick his pregnant wife, and watch Rome burn while he performed music. The Roman system of imperial power had no real checks and balances. Once you became emperor, you were essentially a god on earth. You could do whatever you wanted, and the only real limits were practical ones, like whether the army still supported you or whether you'd run out of money. Moral limits, legal limits, those didn't really apply to emperors. And history is full of examples of what happens when people have that kind of unchecked power. It doesn't usually end well for them or for the people around them. Nero's story with Sporus is just one particularly weird example of a universal truth. Power without accountability turns people into monsters. So here we are, over 2,000 years later, still talking about the emperor who married a eunuch. Still shocked by it, still fascinated by it, still trying to make sense of it. And maybe that's appropriate. Some stories are so strange, so outside our normal understanding of human behavior, that they stick with us across centuries. But as we tell these stories, we should remember the people who didn't have power, who didn't get to write the histories, who were used and abused by those who did. Sporus never got to tell his own story. We'll never know what he actually thought or felt or wanted. All we have are the accounts written by Roman historians who saw him as a prop in Nero's drama. The Emperor Who Married a Eunuch. It sounds like the title of a scandalous novel, doesn't it? But it was real life for Sporus, and his real life ended in despair and suicide. So yeah, it's a wild story. It's shocking and bizarre and almost unbelievable. But it's also a reminder that behind every historical curiosity, there's a human being who lived through it. And sometimes, those human beings deserve our compassion more than our shock. That's the real story of Nero and Sporus. Not just the weirdness, but the tragedy of power, grief, and a life that was never truly lived as one's own.